Greetings of peace, everyone. My name is Bassem Shaban. I'm director of the Peace Institute, and welcome to another um, series on interfaith dialogues, especially right now, that's very timely with the anti-Asian attacks that have been taking place for the last year and a half, not only in the United States, but around the world. We're very blessed to have um a series of panelists or a list of panelists that are very seasoned in their own right as community activists and leaders from their own religious perspective and community to add wisdom and guidance in this conversation and focusing on how we move forward from this with proper solutions that are real and impactful in the community, not only for the Asian community, but for all communities around the world. So I would like to share a quick video to really give us context into the seriousness of this problem.
This surveillance footage shows a 71-year-old Asian grandmother violently shoved to the ground, her purse stolen. Just one of several attacks in California's Bay Area recently. A 91-year-old man pushed in Oakland's Chinatown, one of 3 attacks that day. 84-year-old Thai American Visha Ratanapakdi knocked over while out for a walk. He died a few days later from his injuries. His family saying they believe it was rooted in racism.
This guy should not be let up back on the street. He should be charged with murder. If you see the video, there's nothing non-intentional about it.
Asian American leaders say these attacks are a trend, not isolated incidents.
What we are seeing is just the tip of the iceberg of what is actually happening in the communities.
John Yang is the president of Asian Americans Advancing Justice and blames, in part, anti-Asian rhetoric surrounding the pandemic.
The Asian American community has been faced with effectively 2 pandemics. The first is the COVID-19 pandemic, but the second pandemic that we have faced is also a virus. It's a virus of racism that we have faced.
Asian Americans Advancing Justice has cited at least 3,000 anti-Asian incidents since last February. In New York City, there was an 867% increase in Asian hate crime victims in 2020 compared to the year before. NYPD has created a hate crimes task force.
Hello.
And police in Oakland's Chinatown are stepping up patrols to reassure business owners and families.
We wanted our business owners in our community to know that we care, that we're concerned, and that we're going to do everything we can to keep this community safe.
Nancy Chen, CBS News, New York.
So unfortunately, this shows the level of anti-Asian hate has been taking place. At this point, from the filming of this recording, the hate crimes are up to about 3,800 in the US alone. So all of these issues are very serious, not only to Asian Americans, but all minorities and majority communities in the US. And it's really important we have these conversations, but not only for awareness of the issue, but how we can solve it. And that's why we have distinguished guests with us that include Rabbi Joshua Neely from Temple Israel in Central Florida. We have Pastor Jim Coffin, who is the director of the Interfaith Council of Central Florida. We also have Mr. Danny Chen, who is active in campus college ministry in the community with the Christian community. And then last but not least, we have Imam Muhammad Musri, who is the president of American Islam and the senior imam of the Islamic Society of Central Florida. So each speaker will have about 7 to 10 minutes with opening statements about their perspective of this serious issue. And then after that, we will go into conversation about other matters related to it in more detail. So first and foremost, we will have Rabbi Neely present his perspective. So Rabbi, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. So the Jewish community and I, we grieve with our nation at these most recent murders that just took place last week and the continued rise in hate crimes of all times. You know, violence from greed and violence from foolishness, violence from personal anger, These have plagued humanity since Cain first slew his brother Abel out of jealous rage. Violence from hate, however, is a more modern invention. Only clever perversions of logic built in the modern era can sustain the ridiculous proposition that our skin, our gender, our country of origin, our faith could be cause alone for violence. The rapid rise in violence and hate towards the Asian communities in the United States is a sad reminder of how ready some are, how primed they are to turn to hate when they wish. More than 1,000 years ago, our sages taught that God gathered the dust of the first human being from the four corners of the world: red, black, white, and green. Red, they teach, is the blood, black the innards, white for the eyes and teeth, and green for the body. Why, they ask, from the four corners of the earth? So that if one comes from the east to the west and arrives at the end of their life, as they near their departing from this world, it will not be said to them, "This land is not the dust of your body, it's of mine. Go back to where you were created." Rather, every place that a person walks, from there they were created, and from there they will return. Such clear wisdom should be obvious to even a child, and indeed it has been obvious to most for as long as humans have existed. Yes, some would fight over land or food or water or riches, but the color of our skin, we are all the same, all human. What gain would there be to struggle over the minor differences in appearance? Would such violence make me safer? Would it feed my children? Violence born in hate serves none but those who would divide the world to make it easier to dominate and exploit us all. In our days, this is the root cause of hate. People have been trained to fear. The object of their fear is less important than that they continue to be afraid. They must be afraid of foreigners or native-born. They must be afraid of those of different faith or supposed heretics within their own faith. They must be afraid of change, of differences. Yet somehow, with all this fear, they are supposed to trust that those who spew this garbage will protect them from these imagined dangers. That if only they are given more power to punish and persecute the objects of their hate, that somehow their fears will vanish. But there will always be newly invented fears to direct the paranoia away from those who would rob the fearful of not only their freedom, but their shared sense of humanity. As we in the Jewish community are about to celebrate our holiday of Pesach, Passover, I am reminded of the cruel trick of Pharaoh, who made the Egyptians so afraid of us that he was able to lead them all to ruin. The Egyptians and the Israelites had more to gain from their friendship than Pharaoh realized. 2,000 years ago, the sages who lived in the days of Roman oppression and destruction fought against the temptation to hate the other and spoke of a universal brotherhood. They debated the greatest expression of this ideal. Rabbi Akiva said, "Love your neighbor as yourself is the most fundamental expression." We can learn from this that all of us are called to love all of each other. However, Rabbi Ben Azai countered and said, "This is the book of generations of Adam, taken from Genesis 5, that this phrase is greater. This passage shows that whether we think of each other as neighbors or not, whether we embrace each other as neighbors yet, we must recognize that we come from the same source as all humans." The sages add, "It was for this reason that humanity was created as one person in the beginning, to teach you that anyone who destroys a life, a single life, is considered by God to have destroyed an entire world, and anyone who saves a life is as if they saved the entire world. And it is also to promote peace among all of God's creations, that no one would say to his fellow, 'My ancestors are greater than yours.' And also to express the grandeur of the Holy One. For a human strikes many coins from the same mold, and all coins are identical. But the Holy One strikes every person from the same mold, the mold of that first human, and yet no one is the same as their fellow. Therefore, every person must say, 'For my sake, the world was created.' In their wisdom, Our sages saw past the pain and suffering of their days to hold on to this truth that God shared with us. Each person who lives is reason enough for this world to have been made. They are sacred in their own individuality. There is no hierarchy among God's children, no superior ones who are more deserving of the gifts God has showered upon our shared world. The prophet Amos shared the vision of God 3,000 years ago and said, "Declares the Lord, to me, O Israelites, you are just as the Ethiopians. True, I brought Israel up from the land of Egypt, but I also took the Philistines from Kaphtor and the Arameans from Kir." God cares for all and wishes there to be peace among us all. How terrible it is for a parent to see their children fighting when they should be bound together with the bonds of filial devotion. The overwhelming majority of people in this, our beautiful country, are not racist or driven by hate. However, despite so many turning towards the words of the Torah in their Bibles, so many who loudly profess their allegiance to the principle that we are all created equal, we too often fail to extend our love as widely as we should. What delusion, what fear, what resentment or bitterness buried in our hearts holds us back? We are all born from the same source, crafted from the same primordial dust, imbued with the same spirit, the same soul, breathed into us by the same God. Jewish law has meticulously demanded that even in the most extreme cases, we must love our fellow. How much more so then in our routine lives must we love each other, no matter the stresses or perceived slights? Can we not find that spark of affection that would drive out the darkness? I had the joy of living in Japan for 3 years when I was much younger, there teaching English. And I can tell you there is nothing to compare with meeting and talking with people from different backgrounds. I have had many conversations with people since in this country who have made mistaken statements about the Japanese, or worse, lump all of the people that they think of as Asian into one singular group in their mind, as though there were no differences of history or culture. I am now married to a woman who was born in South Korea and raised in England. I have had many people doubt that she is actually my wife, and I have had many more who question whether my children are mine. Does this frustrate me? Does this anger me? In all honesty, yes, of course it does. But I also use those moments to help the person I am speaking to overcome their biases that led them to these conclusions. I encourage them to learn more about other people firsthand. The more opportunities we can create for this to happen, the more time we spend among those with whom we do not yet feel a strong kinship, the better. But perhaps you despair of love sweeping all people. Perhaps you believe that will only happen in the days of final redemption. If love cannot be achieved, then we will rely on God's other great principle, tzedek, justice. The Torah teaches, justice, justice you will pursue. Why is the word repeated? And why are we told to pursue it, but not given that same command to other of the mitzvot, of God's orders? Because justice is so elusive, because justice demands constant action and effort and will never emerge while we remain passive in the face of injustice. And injustice continues to be perpetrated with too little effort to curb its personal and institutional excesses. We must remember that we have been commanded to love all and provide justice for all. Leviticus calls to us, do not stand idly by the blood of your fellow. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your fellow in your heart. Reprove them and incur no guilt by them. We have a choice. Rebuke those who sin in their injustice and hate, or continue and join in their sin if we remain silent. The words of Malachi must stand before us always. Do we not all have one divine parent? Has not one God created all of us? Why do we deal treacherously, every one against his brother? There is no valid answer to that question. There is only action that we can take to spread love and understanding and to stop the injustices that continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi, for that wisdom. Thank you very much. Pastor Jim.
Well, thank you very much for the privilege to be here with you. And I am glad to hear what the rabbi had to say, because it puts a very, very cogent perspective there. And it's applicable, I think, to all religions. It's not just Judaism, but it's applicable across the board. And I think it's a reminder of how much we can learn from each other and the different perspectives and the different nuances. And we see that within religion, but it's also within culture, within nationality, within race. There are just so many things where we can learn from each other and benefit from it. I grew up on a farm, lived a simple life. I'm not as sophisticated as many people who grew up in larger regions. But on the other hand, there's a certain down-to-earth approach that we have, those of us who come from the land, so to speak. My father used to have a saying. He was a high school dropout, quit after 10 years of education, but a very wise man in practical areas. And he used to have a saying that every person I meet is my superior in some way. And in that way, I can learn from him. And that kind of stuck with me. As children growing up, we don't always listen to our parents. But that was one of the things that stuck like Velcro, this idea that every person is my superior. And then he also talked about the idea that life was made up of all of us being teachers and all of us being pupils throughout life. And so even though we might not think of ourselves as teachers, the way we lived our life, the words we spoke, the thoughts we shared would have impact on others. And so they were actually, even if only through example, teaching. And then also this idea that we go through life, all of us as learners, as students. And very often I think that those of us who are Americans and who have been blessed with material goods and many opportunities and many advantages, we look at those who live in other circumstances and don't understand the fact that they have much that they can teach to us. And so we kind of think, well, this group of people is primitive, or this group of people is that, or this group of people is the other. And therefore we prejudge, and we don't take the opportunity to learn what it is that they have to teach. I've had the privilege of traveling a fair bit in my time, and particularly going to some of the areas of the world that are rather rough and tumble, such as Papua New Guinea, say, the Solomon Islands, places of that nature. And some of those people live a very simple life, much the way they have been living for centuries or even millennia. And so it's easy to come into that kind of situation as if we are the ones with all the knowledge, and they are the ones who have the ignorance. And not often enough do we go into situations like that as learners and say, what do they have to teach us? And I think that applies across the board. One of the things about prejudice, I came across a quote the other day that I found quite interesting. E.B. White said, "Prejudice makes life easier. You can form an opinion without having to search for facts." And I really thought that was a very good summary of what prejudice is. It makes life easier because we can form an opinion without having to look for facts. And I think that very often it's because we don't know the other, that we fear the other, we resent the other, we feel superior to the other, whatever it might be. And as the rabbi said, when he spent time with the Japanese, he came away with a new appreciation of what they were like. And he recognized the misconceptions that other people often have. I had the same privilege by spending time in Mexico. When I was 19 years old, I went as a volunteer worker for the church for a year. And with my father's words ringing in my ears, I went with the idea that these people were superior to me in some way, and I had to find out what that was, and I had to learn from them. And I came away with a great respect and a great love for the Mexican people. And so when I hear some of the comments that are made about Mexicans who have come into the United States, I say, if only you knew, these people the way I do. Now, all people have good, all people have bad, all groups do. Okay, but the similarities that we have are amazing, but also the unique insights, the unique characteristics are so enriching. Now, I happen to be blessed in that I'm married outside of my culture, not too far outside, but I'm married to an Australian, and 2 of my 3 kids were born in Australia. We lived there for 10 and a half years. And I was interested in the way that the Asian people who were closely associated with Australia because of proximity, I was interested in the way that they were treated. And before we get too far and I'm misunderstood, the US actually has the same problem. I'm telling you about Australia's problems first, and then I'll come to our own problems, which reflect what the problems were there. But back in the early settlement of Australia, they looked at the needs that they had. For example, in the gold fields, they needed cooks, they needed people to build the railroads, they needed people to do all the hard work. And they said, let's bring in the Chinese. And the Chinese came and they lived there and they worked there. And there were great Chinese communities in Australia. And then they said, it's kind of a problem to have the Chinese here. They were never really accepted by the Australians. They didn't integrate well, not because they probably wouldn't have been interested, but it just wasn't part of the attitude of the Australians. So they said, no more Chinese. We don't want them here. And so they developed not only an anti-Asian policy, but also an anti-Black policy. So no Africans, no, and it was called the White Australia policy. And then they discovered that it was hard to get doctors and professional people who wanted to go into the remote areas to work, where there's small towns and so on. So they said, we could probably get Chinese and Indians and others to come who have these professional qualifications. We let them into the country if they'll go out and work in these places where Australians don't want to work. And so once again, they opened their doors because here's this unique contribution that could be made. And I found it very interesting when I was living in Australia in the mid-70s, that if I went to a rural town, I could almost guarantee that the doctors in that town would either be Indian or Chinese. But they had to say that they would stay there for X number of years before they would be allowed into the country. We did the same thing in this country. And we used the Chinese to build the railroads, to develop the country, and then we resented the fact that they were here. It was to our advantage to have them here. Of course, with the Blacks in an even more dramatic way, we brought them into the country, to do the work for us that we didn't want to have to do, and then we resented that they were here. Now, not only am I married to an Australian, but I have another very delightful insight into another culture because my youngest son is married to a Vietnamese woman. And her parents were boat people who escaped from Vietnam, came here, met, married. They were brought here because of the ministry of the Catholic Church that was trying to help people resettle, refugees resettle. So they came and they raised 3 daughters here, and our son married one of those girls. And they've worked hard and they've tried to make this country a better place, and they've tried to make it their place. But there is this sense of, why do we have these people here? And so just a couple of weekends ago, our son and his wife, who live in, the Vietnamese wife, live in Los Angeles. They decided that they would drive here to Orlando and then drive up to Atlanta. He works in film production, and there was a TV series that he was going to be working on in Atlanta for a couple of weeks. And so he thought, well, I'll bring my wife with me. She had a hiatus from teaching, and we'll stop in Orlando, see the family, drive up to Atlanta. And so when they got here, they said, when we drove across certain parts of the country and got out of the car at the gas stations and so on, we definitely had the sense that Kathleen wasn't welcome. And, not that anything was necessarily said, but just kind of the coldness, the aloofness, the withdrawnness. And so we talked about it quite a bit while they were here. They went to Atlanta and arrived about 5 o'clock on the same evening that the murders took place. And already she's ill at ease because of the fact that, she feels that she hasn't been appropriately accepted. And then she, hears this kind of thing. And so she loves the country, she loves the people, she loves her husband, she loves our family. But there is this underlying prejudice that she feels, and it has increased dramatically over the past few years. Well, the rabbi mentioned about the religion, the fact that we all come from single parent, a single couple, Adam and Eve. All of us are from the same stock. We're all the children of God, so to speak. And in Christianity, Jesus was a revolutionary in many ways. And one of the things that came out of Jesus' teaching, particularly in the writings of Paul, was the idea that if we're a follower of Christ, and I'm talking now to Christians, if we're a follower of Christ, then all the barriers that existed before are no longer valid. The gender barriers between male and female, that's no longer valid. The barrier between the slave and the free person, qualitatively, no longer valid. The barriers that came because of our ethnicity, no longer valid, because we're all one. We're all the children of God, and doubly the children of God then through Christ, as we teach as Christians. And then in the book of Revelation, it talks about the new earth and the beautiful place that we're going to go to heaven, the new earth. And it describes it by telling about all the people who were there. And it's people from every language and kindred and tongue and nation. Everybody is there, because what God has planned, he has planned for everybody, not just for white Americans, not just for men, not just for some other special group, but it's for everybody. And if we're going to live out the values of Christianity, those of us who are Christian, we have to apply it to everybody. Everybody is our friend. Everybody is our brother and sister. Everyone is our teacher. Everyone can teach us certain things because they are superior in some ways, and we can share, and together the world can be better because we're all working together. So that's all that I have to say right now, but thank you very much for the privilege to say it.
Thank you, Pastor Coffin. Okay, Danny, thank you for joining us. So any perspective?
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to first say that it's a privilege for me to be here. I know that I'm kind of a newer comer here, but particularly I want to thank everybody that's on this panel for creating space, particularly for me as somebody that's representing the Asian American community, to have the space to express both from my own ethnic sort of experience, but also from my perspective, also as a religious leader. So I think, it's been an exhausting year for Asian Americans. There's moments of grief, both, like the video that was shown earlier. I don't remember the exact representative that was speaking into this, but this idea that there's two pandemics for Asian Americans, at least that's how it's felt for this past year. The one that has to do with this coronavirus, but also this one where everywhere we go, we have to sort of be on the lookout for our safety, and if not ourselves, certainly for our family, for parents, for grandparents. So it's been a exhausting time. It's been a time that I think even to some point bred some cynicism, just from this idea or experience of feeling disappointed over and over and over again of how our communities continue to sort of be ignored or pushed to the side, that our voices are oftentimes unheard. With nearly 4,000 cases of assault and attacks on Asian Americans, I think for me and my position tonight, as I'm sharing a few words, I really want to come particularly from a perspective where I want to address a little bit more from out of sort of what happened last week in Atlanta, because I think of all the things that have happened, this most recent one that happened last week was what the media would consider as one of the high-profile incidents. And I think there's just so many different layers to it that I would be remiss if I did not at least attempt to help people understand the multi-layer that of different things that are problematic that goes into this. So particularly when I heard of what happened last week, one of the initial responses was I felt like this story particularly hit close to home for me because I began to write a Facebook post about a very vulnerable and personal story that has since sort of gone viral unexpectedly. But I was telling the story about my own grandmother. I was telling a story about it wasn't until 2 summers ago that I had found out that my own grandmother actually had to endure a season of her life being a sex worker inside of a massage parlor in Taiwan. That's the home that she was from. So the context of that story was that my grandmother was born into a post-war impoverished kind of society, and her birth parents were in desperate need for money in order to cover some of her father's medical expenses. So out of her 10 siblings, she was the one daughter that was sold to another family to be the daughter to another family. I can only just imagine the kind of psychological damage that happens in a young woman when you spend your whole life wondering, why was I the one that was chosen to be unwanted by my own parents, right? So fast forward when she came of age, when she became a young lady, she was taken in as a mistress by the man who would essentially be my grandfather, who I have no relationship with. He was already a married man, and my grandmother was a poor woman that had nowhere to go. So she was taken in by this man, and he ended up fathering my dad, my aunt, and my uncle. But since the nature of these, kids were born out of an illegitimate kind of marriage or arrangement, that family did not recognize them as their own. So they were sort of kicked to the curb, and they were essentially abandoned to fend for themselves. So as a single mother, my grandmother, being uneducated, being illiterate, in order for her to have to figure out ways to put food on the table, to take care of her kids, she basically sold the only thing that she had, which was her body, in order to put food on the table. So, she began to work in massage parlors as a essentially sex worker, subjugating her body to the exploitation of strange men. This was something that my father had never spoken of. He only told my mom after my grandmother had passed, and my mother only told me after my father had passed. So, as you can imagine, being in a shame-based culture, this was one of the most painful secrets of my family. So I wanted to highlight that personal story and share that because I think most people don't see that massage parlor workers, and let me just be clear, there hasn't been any confirmation on whether or not these victims last week were in fact sex workers. However, massage parlor workers oftentimes face constant abuse, either by their employers, by their customers, by law enforcement even, and in many cases by human traffickers. So there's literally nowhere that is essentially safe for these women. And little attention is given to the question as to why so many women, in particular women of a certain ethnicity, tend to end up in these type of professions. And I think we, especially those of us that come from religious backgrounds, sort of have a high regards for our sense of morality, it's very easy for us to quickly assign a certain type of social stigma toward women in these professions, either seeing them as morally loose or sexually promiscuous, but oftentimes not able to see that the reality is that many of these women are finding themselves in desperate situations. And it is in light of these desperation that they subject themselves to this kind of exploitation. So when we fail to see that, then what's left is that we fail to see them as human beings that are created with dignity, that these women have bodies that reflect the very image of God. So, when I think about all of these things that happen and how quickly the news medias began to sort of speculate and generate and formulate different narratives as to the motives behind these shootings. Many of us in the Asian American community, we just sat, anxiously and waited to see, in this year of a surge on attacks on our community, was this another incident of hate? And according to the officials, the sheriff that spoke, very quickly it was determined in, claiming that this was more likely to be connected to a sex addiction and not necessarily due to racial bias. And I think many of us, particularly a lot of the women leaders in our community that I deeply respect, began to see immediately just how much gaslighting took place, in the sense of something that is much more complex, something that you cannot take at face value to tell the whole story, has been gaslit in such a way to claim it being something that is as simple as that. So I think there are many different angles for me, speaking both as an Asian American, but also as a faith leader, of different things that we need to consider. I think we need to look at the long historical context of how Asian women have been objectified and sexualized to a degree where there's a whole industry that's dedicated to the fetishization of them. We need to consider how that, goes all the way back to the history of colonialism, to this idea of, the expansion of mostly European nations, and how that evolved into sort of this idea of manifest destiny, how we just go and, with our self-proclaimed God-given rights, to go and take and exploit whatever we come across as our own. So, I think we need to consider the system that continues to sort of breed this type of sentiment in society, where men visit these places for nothing more than just their own sexual gratification, and completely disregard the fact that these are human beings who are sisters, who are daughters, who are mothers to somebody else. But particularly, I think what's really interesting of how this all intersected with the faith is that this shooter, this suspect, he confessed to being a Christian. In fact, I think from different sources I've read that he's actually the son of a pastor. And, he was active in his church. He engaged in summer mission trips. And he also confessed having an issue with pornography and sex addiction. But the problem is, I think we need to think about what kind of sort of theological expression enabled a young man that professes a faith and also confesses a certain struggles to decide that the right action to do would be to eliminate those who sort of he deemed as symbols of temptation. I think there's a huge failure of the church, the capital C church, that I feel like not many have addressed so far. This whole idea, and I'm so thankful for Pastor Jim in naming some of those things, the effects of exploitation, the effects of employing different ethnic groups to serve something that benefits the building of this nation, including, Chinese railroad workers, but going all the way back to the whole idea of enslavement. I think we cannot ignore the process by which early Christian missionaries have actually colluded with the forces of colonialism in order to gain power, in order to get their message across. And And if we understand that context, then we can actually have a sobering look at the history of this nation. And let me just name the elephant in the room by saying that when we see it in that context, then we begin to see that there's actually never been a single moment in history in this country where the American church has not at best passively benefited from, and at worst actively participated in the systems of racism. So, you know, when I look at even this young man's church, his home congregation, and the statement that they sort of put out since this this shooting, you know, they've taken a posture of distancing themselves from this young man. They have essentially disowned this young man, and all of the sort of justification that they had to do with how this is a personal sin that this young man needs to be solely responsible for. And I think for me, as a person of color, also as a self-professing Christian, what bothers me about that idea is that is rooted in such an individualistic worldview that I think is deeply connected to the colonialistic framework of our current expression of theology that's you know very much alive in many of our churches. So I think we need to consider the entire framework of this young man's faith. How, you know, there's been reports saying that, you know, there's an obsession that he has with guns. And I think we cannot ignore how some of those sentiments are rooted in an idolatry that is deeply tied between Christianity and nationalism, this idea of God and country, and a theology that is infused for centuries in white supremacy that continues to sort of back the Second Amendment as this inalienable right that's awarded to them by God himself, when in fact, the Christ that I actually follow lived his life as a suffering servant. It's, you know, it's the story of a powerful God that chose to reduce himself to become the least of us in order to die a death on behalf of a sinful humanity. So there was never an expression by this God that sort of, you know, took the stance of standing his ground and wielding his divine power in the face of a defiant humanity. I think that is a version of Jesus Christ that the North American church had made up. So I think it's important for me representing Christianity today in this, you know, forum to name that. Like, I think these are some of the sins of our church in its modern expression. And I think that as a person of faith and also as a person of color, I'm calling the church to actually sort of step into a posture of repentance before we can even begin to dismantle some of these things. You know, I think one of the things I'm really glad that Pastor Jim had mentioned some of the injustices observed in places like Australia. And, you know, I think we also observe similar history in places like South Africa. So when you think about South Africa, when you think about Australia, and when you think about the United States, these are all largely nations that are direct results of colonialism. And racism is a rampant and very real problem, and that's observed in all of these nations. But I think what's different between those of us that are here in the US compared to, say, somewhere like South Africa is that there has never been a national posture of seeing and owning up to the gravest sins that came into the establishment of this country and come into a place of repentance as a nation. So I think that continues to be part of the larger narrative that creates the problems that we continue to see today. So I'll stop at that, and yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Danny. Appreciate it. Imam Musri?
Thank you so much for having me. And I really enjoyed listening to your perspectives without having to repeat a lot of what was said. I want to say big amen for what Rabbi Neely said. Kind of captured most of my views on this issue, the sanctity of life, regardless of whose life it is. God's law is, since the beginning, is very clear. As the rabbi mentioned, that it is stated the same in the Quran, in our Holy Scripture, in chapter 5, verse 32, that whoever takes a single life, it is as if he took the lives of all of humanity. And whoever saved one life, it is as if he or she saved the life of all of humanity. And that is a message that I do not think faith leaders are communicating hard enough and frequently enough to congregations, to young men who are going out and massacring innocent people while they're going about their daily lives. And in those verses, it did not say what kind of life it is. If it is, the life of a fellow Muslim or Christian or Jew, or it's just the life of a human, any human. And we have these universal, commandments that we all know, we all teach in our places of worship. Yet, I think, as Danny said, there is this bit of hypocrisy where we allow nationalism to overtake or to shape our religious views, and especially when it comes to the other. If that other is a Jew, or that other is a Muslim, or that other is of a Black or Asian, or whatever the other could be, we conveniently apply the rules to ourselves and say it doesn't apply to others. And we have seen this play out, the anti-Semitism, the, anti-Asian hate, the anti-Muslim hate, it's all happening. And many faith leaders actually either stand by and say nothing, or they, from their pulpits, they kind of promote it indirectly in the name of defending the country or our identity as a country. And also the failure of our political leaders. We just had 4 years of top leadership that was clearly pushing hate. And, when the former president blamed China for the pandemic, it was an indirect message to all his supporters to blame, Chinese individuals for their problems. And we have seen that spike since February of 2020, and people attacking Chinese businesses in New York and Los Angeles. We have seen and mind you that many people can't tell the difference between a Chinese or a Japanese. They just go after any Asian individual or business. And that is to blame the problems and the failures that we had and our healthcare system had on somebody else. We are failing on the faith side, on the political side, as well as on our civic side. Many times we do not highlight the achievements and the contributions, as Pastor Jim said, of Asian Americans from the beginning of this nation till today, that have led in many fields, in technology, in medicine, in engineering, in every field. We all drive vehicles that are designed and made by Asians. We all use computers and phones and technology that we know it is made in China or made in Japan or Korea. And yet when we come to the individuals in our social lives, as Pastor Jim said, we want them to work for us and do the works we don't want to work, but then we turn and hate them and we don't want them among us. That is the result of a combination of failures. And it's not going to go away just by wishing it away. We have to be deliberate at talking about these issues from the pulpit. It is the time where people listen, leaders and laymen, they all listen to what faith leaders have to say. And with the authority that we have, speaking on behalf of God from Scripture, we have to address these social ills that are tearing apart our communities and causing all this grief. We have to hold our media leaders also responsible. Unfortunately, so much of the news coverage is biased, and so much of it is justification, and so much of it is, talking about, oh, this young man's reason, this or that. It doesn't matter what the justification is. That is not to allow our minds to go and give this man who have taken the lives of 8 people a reason to say, well, because he was sex addicted, or maybe he hated, or no, what he did was a massacre, and it has to be focused on that. Sometimes we allow ourselves, to believe what the media narrative is, when we know that the media is spinning the story for their own financial benefits, to promote this and to allow copycats to go out and, another young man was, I guess, caught in Atlanta in a Publix with cache of weapons, who was about to commit another massacre. And we have a crisis in this country. We have crisis with guns, and our political leaders don't have the will to address it. Too many massacres have happened, and just about in every one of them, we see an AR-15 has been used by a young man who is mentally ill. And we have a problem with mental illness that we have not dedicated the proper resources to address it and to help these people and to prevent these massacres and the death of people, innocent people on the streets. And every time, all what we hear is condemnation and offering condolences, and then the country just moves on to the next massacre. And I feel that we faith leaders have to have collective effort to put pressure on our elected officials to say, we need to address mental illness, and we need to address the gun problem in our nation. We don't see this happening in, say, Japan. We see it here happening at a much higher frequency. We're not going to prevent all massacres or all shootings, but we definitely could reduce them dramatically by perhaps 90% if we can focus on these issues. And I'm sorry to say that for 20 years, I have witnessed massacres in schools and synagogues and churches and mosques. And every time there is this, we want to do something, and then it fades away. We give up quickly. We move on and we start talking about other topics. We need to focus like laser on these issues until we solve them, until the proper laws are enacted and no more innocent people getting killed like this. And so I'm not going to wait for others. I want to say my responsibility is to speak up against it. The Prophet Muhammad said, if you see something wrong, change it with your hand. If you can, change it with your tongue, speak about it. If you can, then change it in your heart. And that's the least of faith. We cannot accept it because it happened to somebody else and not to us, because it's going to come back to reach us one day. So I don't want to make it longer, but I want to say amen to my fellow speakers who have really addressed this issue. And I want to leave to the moderator, though, if there are questions that we want to address. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think you guys all did a great job in really merging our discussion on also other issues that we were planning related to the roots of the problem, from perception to the media to gun violence and the ignorance of history that many people have in America and around the world. Now, Imam Musri mentioned the issue of gun violence, and I read an article yesterday that, believe it or not, even with the pandemic, 2020 has been the deadliest year in America, with about close to 20,000 deaths from gun violence compared to the last 20 years. And many people were shocked about this because of the lockdown. Many people assumed it was going to reduce that, but in fact, it did not. And I think Danny mentioned that just like most of these incidents against the Asians are not reported unless it's a mass murder. Same thing with gun violence. These are shootings from domestic incidents, from gang violence, and of course, mass murder events that cause this rise in gun violence. And of course, the stress and the lockdown affected people's psychology. And these are just the deaths. The injuries are close to over 20,000. Now, my question for everyone is, what do you think can an average citizen do, every day to try to reduce these impacts?
I think one thing we can do, it's a little bit like if you see something, say something. But too often I have stood by when bigots made comments that were derogatory in some way. And, it's difficult to speak up, and you may be misunderstood, and you don't want to create tensions and embarrassment and so on. And so I've just stood by. And I think that I need to not only call myself into check, but I need to be willing to do it for others as well and say, no, you're wrong. And Rabbi Neely mentioned, after his Japan experience, recognizing that people had these misperceptions, and he could say, no, that's not the way it is. And I think if even if we take it further, for me, even things like blonde jokes, where I'm taking a category of person and I'm making fun of them, I'm clustering them all together, and we wouldn't think of blondes as being a persecuted minority. But the more that I allow that kind of senseless thing to go on and participate in it and aid and abet it, it's going to go into other areas as well. So, I think that individually we can speak up, and we can try to make sure that we're not aiding and abetting or in any way exacerbating the situation.
I think that's very well said. And I would just like to add that one of the topics that you raised there is one that I think is very critical and often not properly policed in our own interactions, which is when somebody will say, oh, no, it was a joke. It was a joke. Why are you taking this so seriously? As though somehow joking in an offensive or hateful or about a stereotype, somehow that makes it okay. As though racism is only a problem if the person actually has a hood over their head or a swastika on their arm. But if they're only joking about racism, then that should still be acceptable in the minds of many. And that is something that I think is categorically false, and something that we need to say, that if you find that funny, then I'm not going to be around you. Obviously, we can't, throw people in jail for making inappropriate jokes, and nor would I want to infringe on their rights. But it's my right to distance myself from a person who can't understand that their sense of humor is an act of senseless violence. And it may be only one step towards an action such as we saw in Atlanta, but it is a step in that direction, and it provides very conscious cover for those who want to promote more hatred. If you have studied the rise of extremism, or I should say the resurgence of extremism on these topics in the United States, you'll know that very consciously within the playbooks of the white supremacists and other groups, they are aware of the protective shield that allowing racist humor gives them to help test the waters on what is or isn't acceptable and to entice people into ever more extreme belief systems. And we have to, as a nation and as individuals, say, no, that is not funny. It is not even remotely allowed. You cannot make fun of people. You can make fun of a person. If there is somebody that deserves to be mocked or deserves to be made fun of because of their personal, the personal thing that they have done that is wrong and deserves to be held up to the community. For example, if there is a public figure that is earning ridicule because of his or her actions, that individual, yes, we can absolutely laugh at them. I would never want to take away the late night comedy tracks, but we would not laugh at their race. We would not laugh at their religion. We would not laugh at their country of origin. We would only say that that individual is flawed, that individual needs to be fixed. And if we cannot make that distinction, then we will never be able to move past this problem of infectious stereotyping of others, which only leads to more and more drastic behavior.
Yeah, I think much of the debate around what you two gentlemen were just talking about oftentimes goes back to the defense of the rights to free speech, right? Particularly in this country. And I think when we are so careless about free speech and using that as an apologetics for our justification to say whatever we want, we actually forget the fact that words have power, right? I think much of the violence, much of the attacks and assaults that we saw were directly incited by the usage of words, particularly by people who are in powerful positions, and I'm just going to name it. I think the previous administration and its deliberate ways of associating a deadly virus to an entire race of people has greatly contributed to what we are observing today, right? But I think there's even a basis on how we see this in the faith traditions. I think so many people want to come back and say, it was just a joke. Like a lot of people be like, stop being so sensitive, don't be such a snowflake. It's just a joke. It's just words. It's just words. It's just words. But if we were to put a religious spin on it, when we come back to the creation story, and when we come back to the moment where Eve is standing under the tree, where the serpent was influencing her to take a bite of the fruit that God had commanded her not to take, he did not forcibly physically stuff the fruit in her mouth. It was a manipulation of free speech. So in that sense, you can argue that the power of free speech was one of the root causes of the fall of humanity. So, even in our religious interpretation of the fall of humanity, if it can be rooted back to careless use of words or the manipulation of the usage of words, you can bet that it is, words have power, and words can directly incite some of the violence that we're observing today. So I think people need to, I think people in our nation particularly need to recognize ways that they perhaps hide their bigotry behind free speech and really examine free speech or not is whatever you have to express contributing to the progress of human a harmonious society, or you causing harm. So So I think that's one thing in terms of moving forward. I think another thing in terms of what can we do, what can we call the society to move forward. I think I do have a message to the Christian community in particular, but particularly the white evangelicals, because I think allyship is a very interesting thing. And I think even in the way that it operates, we continue to see different nuances. But one of the things that I have, that I'm fortunate enough to have in my life, is having co-laborers and, you know, colleagues, other ministers that I work with who are from a white majority dominant, you know, background. And when it comes to issues of injustice and racial trauma, oftentimes for me as a person of color to voice against that, it's easily dismissed. You know, I can easily be labeled as just, you know, he's just another angry minority. But some of my white friends have the privilege and the platform to be able to say the same exact thing that I would say, and yet be able to carry a conversation that could eventually land in a change of heart or change of attitude or the learning of something that's different. Now, I think there's its own set of problems even with that. But I think I'm calling on particularly white evangelicals who seek to be allies to recognize that this is an exhaustive work that marginalized communities continue to face. But we have no choice, because if we choose to stay silent, then the consequences continue to fall on us. But what's different is for our white majority brothers and sisters, if you choose to be silent, you might continue to live your life without facing much impact of this, but the negative consequences of your silence continue to fall on the marginalized communities. So that is the power that you have that comes with your privilege. And my call is for you to recognize that and to steward it well.
I want to speak to the gun violence and the continuous glorification in movies and games. You know, guns have basically one purpose, one use, and that is to kill. You do not draw with it, you do not cook with it, you can only use it to kill. And for some reason, in our country here, it's glorified as a good thing. You know, it's a good thing to own a gun. It's an important right. And I understand the Second Amendment, but I interpreted that it was talking about a militia, which we have. We have an army, we have a National Guard, we have, you know, police. They have plenty of guns to defend the country against, you know, external enemies. But I don't understand why we as a nation have more guns than people. And especially among faith communities who support the idea of, you know, you can be a good person of faith and a gun, you know, carrier, because it's a weapon. It's an instrument of death, of killing someone. It's not something that after you kill someone, you can bring them back and say, sorry, I didn't mean it. So we have to speak up as faith people. Either we want to choose life or we're going to choose death. If you choose life, you cannot be going and spending a lot of money to buy a gun and 2 and 3. And if you want to choose death, then you're not choosing faith. And that is a conversation that needs to be had from the pulpit with the congregations. You know, if somebody is mentally ill, everybody looks at them like it's their fault, they're stigmatized. But I don't blame the mentally ill who has no control over, you know, their illness. I have problem with us, the healthy ones, if we are healthy, who don't see a problem in owning a lot of guns and feeling like this is a good thing, or it's okay. And or we spend money to watch movies that are just violence, full of violence. And we let our children play games that are full of violence. And we expect nothing to happen, somehow magically, just like Rabbi Neely said about the joke. We just think that, oh, it's okay. What stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. No, I think, good guys with guns are coming down, also falling. Officers have fallen at the hands of guns. So we have to address this elephant in the room and say, guns and faith are not compatible. They don't go together. In a free society, in a civilized society, in a society where we have courts, if you have a quarrel with someone, a difference of opinion, you go. There are civil ways of settling your differences, and you don't take matters into your own hand and end it with a bullet. So we don't address that enough. And I have spoken one time at a national conference for evangelicals about, this connection between the guns and the church. And I say, if you profess that you are pro-life, you cannot be professing that you're pro-guns, because guns don't save lives, they end lives. There was big laughter in the hall, but I haven't seen any change since. And I feel that we need to speak about it, even though it's not popular with faith leaders.
And I think, on this topic, as you say, we are all responsible for this, and we must speak about it. But there is a certain hypocrisy, a double standard that exists that I think we also have to be aware of, which is to say that if there is a shooting or a terrible deed that is done by a Muslim, that the entire Muslim community is jumping out to say that they condemn it, that they denounce that this person acted, that they did not act in the name of their faith, that what they did was wrong. If a Jewish person does something that is reprehensible, the Jewish community jumps out and says, we are terribly upset that this person behaved. This is not what we stand for. This is not what we hold. If we didn't, if there was an act committed by a Jew or a Muslim and our communities were silent, we would be roundly condemned for being silent in the face of the action done by one of our people. However, when an action is taken by somebody that is from the Christian world, especially if that person happens to also be white, nobody holds the Christian world or the white world responsible for their deeds. Nobody expects all the pulpits to be filled with sermons condemning those actions on the very next Sabbath. Instead, it's, well, that's an individual. He's not a real American. He's not a true Christian. There is a no true Scotsman fallacy that allows the goalposts to constantly be moved so that no stigma or responsibility ever seems to rest upon the shoulders of the communities from which many of these people come. Now, I don't believe in any way, shape, or form that even a sizable portion of the Christian or white community support what these people do. But we need to hear universal condemnation from every corner, whether they are part of the person's community or not, for any of these acts, just as we will universally condemn any reprehensible act done by a member of our faith or our communities. That is the way that we show the world what we stand against. And it is the way that we show the members of our community that if they take actions like this, we will not stand with them. We will not try to claim that they are not true members of our community, because unfortunately, God knows they have often been members of our community, but they do not speak for us, they do not act for us, and we want no others to try and imitate their behavior in the name of our faiths or our communities.
I mean,
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Yeah, that's so well said. Yeah, and that's what I was pointing at earlier. So I think part of the action that I'm calling even is for the congregation where this young man was a part of, rather than to take a posture of washing your hands clean and distancing yourself from him, but to consider the institution of the white evangelical church as a whole on ways of reflecting and examining how your theology in the context of a colonialistic history has actually fostered and nurtured this type of thinking, and to come to a posture of repentance in that. So thank you so much, Rabbi Neely.
Well, thank you, everyone. That was a great discussion. A lot was presented, many issues coming together because we want to really make a difference, not only based on rhetoric and, as the Imam and others mentioned, with visuals and condolences, but real solid change. And I think this is a great step in this journey where we as Americans from all shapes and sizes and religions and social statuses can really make a difference without necessarily waiting for the powers that be or the politicians to make a difference, because obviously it hasn't happened anytime. So I really want to thank you for everything that you guys mentioned. I definitely know that many people in the community, from any community, will benefit. And I want to just close by saying, especially to Pastor Jim's comment about what's known as the enablers, who watch things happen and do not say anything, whether it's a hate crime or an incident of that's about a violence that is about to happen. They usually cower and stay on the sidelines, because as we all well know, the famous quote by Edmund Burke, a famous Irish philosopher, who said, "The only reason there is evil in the world is because good people stand on the sidelines doing nothing." And I think we contradict that based on our work in our own communities and your thoughts and perspectives that really pushes people to make a difference in their community. And I will close with the famous quote by Martin Luther King, who said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Because unfortunately, we tend to look at these problems as, okay, this is against the Asian community, so if I'm not Asian, it's not my problem. Or this is against the Jewish community or the Muslim community or the white community. If I'm not part of that community, it's not my problem. And I think that attitude and that culture has caused us to come to this breaking point in America and the world. But when we, as Rabbi Neely mentioned, when we all come together as people of any faith and any background and social status and ethnic background, when we see an injustice, as Martin Luther King said, that is my problem. And if I can make a difference, like Imam Musri mentioned of the Prophet, you can maybe change it with your hands, or if you cannot, you can tell someone about it. And if you cannot, at least you put it in your heart and know that it is wrong. So let us work together, and that would be our next step as faith leaders and community leaders to really make a solid difference. So thank you very much, and we look forward to building a great relationship with each other to solve these problems. Thank you very much. God bless you.
Thank you, everybody, for your solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.